This is Musical Talk.
Musical Talk.
The UK's independent musical theatre podcast.
Musical Talk, the UK independent musical theatre podcast.
Hello, welcome to Musical Talk. I'm Nick Hudson, lovely to be back with you again. I'm also with Professor Robert Gordon from Goldsmiths University. Hello Robert, how are you?
Hello Nick, I'm well, thank you.
Good. It's with kind of tinted glasses we look at this episode today. I want to talk to you about two things. The first being Victoria Wood, who is a British comedy legend who recently left us. She passed away last week upon recording this episode, so I think it was a nice idea that we discuss her, because she did write a rather fun musical, and she was very musical in her from the beginning, wasn't she?
Yes, I think, she may have been the best lyricist of her generation. I think, she was very good songwriter, both music and lyrics.
And always perfect rhymes as well, which
Absolutely.
is something I was thinking about, because she did a very famous song called The Ballad of Barry and Frida or something, wasn't it, which is a parody of Cole Porter's Let's Do It.
Yes, absolute genius. I mean, that was a work of absolute genius. And I think because she was a performer, and a great performer in a way, she knew how to write for performers. And so I think the lyrics really worked well with the music. I mean, they sat absolutely on the music, and she knew exactly how to, when she played around, sometimes she played around and tried to stuff a whole lot of different lyrics, into a very short musical phrase. She did it absolutely with a sensitivity to the relationship between music and lyric. She was one of a kind. I mean, I personally rated the musical Acorn Antiques very, very high. I think the only reason it closed after 6 months, sort of packed houses in the West End, was it was far too expensive to run, because it was a cast of stars.
It was also far too expensive to see as well for many people.
It was the first show that I think where prices were £50.
£70.
Oh, were they?
Yeah, top price was £70.
Top price was £70.
We laugh at that now, but...
Yes, but it was very high for, I think it was 2005, wasn't it? They were paying a company of stars to do it, including Julie Walters, and you're not going to expect them to.
Well, it was
to
either
be in
Victoria
it for more
Wood
than
was in it,
6 months,
or Julie Walters was in it. Wasn't it?
Usually Julie Walters played Mrs. Overall, but there were some performances where Victoria Wood went on.
I didn't see Acorn Antiques. I presume you saw it.
Yes, I did.
How not groundbreaking, but how did it take the model of the TV show, which was parodying very bad live things like Crossroads, which was a live
recording of a soap opera, yes,
and then doing the documentary about it, which I believe Act 2 was about the people playing the people in Acorn Antiques, the musical.
The first act was sort of rehearsals and the creation of an episode of Acorn Antiques, and the second act was actually trying to stage and film an episode. It was brilliant, because I think what she did was she created another character for Julie Walters, and the second half was simply
it's like Noises Off in a way.
Parody of Acorn, a kind of version of Acorn Antiques. But again, what was clever was the way she was able to develop the characters in the first act, as well as and to link them to the characters in the second act. I think they later, when they toured it, they only performed the second act. It was rewritten and they performed the second act.
It's almost as if the audience only wanted to see Acorn Antiques. They weren't too interested in the backstory.
In the making of, yes. I thought it worked very well as a complete musical with the two act version, which I think was the one that actually has been recorded for television.
Yeah, I was going to say, it is that rare thing where a musical was recorded for television, and hopefully they'll air it in honour of Victoria Wood.
Well, again, they did the same more recently with That Day We Sang, the show that she wrote about 8 or 9 years ago, which was a stage musical.
I mean, we have to consider Victoria Wood was an immense talent. She could not only do stand-up, but she did that much later in her career. She could play the piano, she could write lyrics, she could direct, she could perform in her own stuff, she could write brilliantly for other actresses as well. most famously Julie Walters, but also Celia Emery.
She wrote brilliantly for
Yeah.
Patricia Routledge as
Yeah.
well, more occasionally, but she wrote brilliantly for her. She herself was a one-woman band. I mean, she could do almost everything in theatre, both as a performer and as a comic writer. I would put her, I'd say, yes, everyone says she's a national treasure. She is. She represents something in British culture, peculiarly British, which is...
Especially northern culture as well.
Well,
which
I'd
is
say
important.
yes. She was somewhere in between, on the level of high-end and popular culture, she was somewhere in between Alan Bennett and Les Dawson. So, she had the best of both the vulgar, end-of-the-pier seaside comics and a literary comic writer like Alan Bennett. She was a genius.
Do you think we'll see a lot more of her now on television? It always seems to happen, doesn't it?
I'm sure they're going to replay and reissue a number of her plays for television and a number of her, her comic sketches and series and her stand-up concerts.
What did you think of The Day We Sang?
I thought it was charming and low-key and very moving, and it showed her range, because although she was a mistress of low and high comedy, she could also be very subtle and moving, and I think you see that in some of her plays. Some of them are really sad, and she herself said, I think brilliantly, that we lead such unhappy lives, most of us, and that's why we need comedy. And I think that's a real insight into the way she worked. She brought out the funny aspects of human sadness and the sad aspects of what's funny about life.
There was a very famous sketch about a 12-year-old girl who goes off to swim the English Channel, and she doesn't come back. And it's incredibly sad, but of course, because it's Victoria Wood playing this 12-year-old girl, due to her physical performance, there are elements of comedy and elements of comedy in the lines, but much like David Renwick's writing in One Foot in the Grave and stuff like that, it is tinged with an incredible dark undertone, which that's a very British thing to do, isn't it?
Yes,
the tragedy and the comedy in the same line.
I think so, and to sometimes laugh at what is potentially tragic. That seems to me to be very British. Sort of stiff upper lip in some ways. But I think the other aspect of Victoria Wood was that she was a woman. She was probably the first woman, at least since Joyce Grenfell, to break through in such a large-scale way into the media and into the theatre as a comic. And she was a stand-up comic and held her own against all the big male comedians. And it's a very masculine world. I think even now, women all say in their obituaries and responses to her sad death that she was their role model. And I think she stood up for ordinary women. There she was, not a catwalk model, not slim and trim. She was an attractive woman.
Just normal.
She was an attractive, ordinary-looking woman. And so she represented the ordinary person. Lower middle class, perhaps, not pretentious, or occasionally she satirized the pretension of some of those people, but she absolutely represented the spirit and the guts and the grit of those women. So
much like comedians now like Kathy Burke and Joe Brand and Sarah Milligan and all these other...
absolutely. But she was gentler. And that also was why I think so many women identified with her and so many men learnt about what it is to be a woman from her.
If you're not familiar with Victoria Wood's work, just go on YouTube and spend many, many fun hours. A hugely important figure in the female comedy world. I want to talk to you about a musical which I recently saw about another very important female figure in the comedy world.
Another funny lady.
Well, two, really. We're going to talk about Sheridan Smith and her performance in Funny Girl, which is currently playing at the Savoy Theatre. Well, but you haven't seen it, but you know the piece more than I did when I went in, so it's like our two minds are going to meet now and come up with an opinion.
I am going to see it in a couple of weeks, yes.
So Fanny Bryce was the first comedienne of what would you say?
She was probably the best of the comedians associated with the Ziegfeld Follies and had a career, which went on until the 50s. So her career spanned quite a long time. This is one earlier episode in her life, which Funny Girl is based on, her marriage to Nicky Arnstein. What I'd like to know is how much do we come out celebrating or remembering Fanny Bryce, and how much is it about the performer? Because I think one of the things that happened in the film and the original stage production with Streisand, is that Streisand not only stood in for Fanny Bryce, she overwhelmed Fanny Bryce. In a sense, it became no longer really a tribute to Fanny Bryce, because there's not a lot of detail about Fanny Bryce's actual life in the musical. And I wondered what you felt about Sheridan Smith's version. Did it rectify this in any way? Did it show you something about Fanny Bryce, or was it more a star turn for the performer?
I did think about that, and I thought, is the material we're actually seeing gags of hers, like the wonderful Rat Tat 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 song where she's playing,
Mademoiselle from Armentières.
Yeah, sort of a Hitler, Colonel Schwartz kind of a character. I thought, everyone's laughing at this, but is this something she would have done? Would it have been this funny? And I sat there thinking throughout, partly because of location, partly because of composer, partly because of subject matter, partly because the end of Act 1 ends at a railway station with a big song written for a female. I sat thinking, this is very like Gypsy.
Yes, of course, because of the involvement of Julie Stein.
Yeah.
And it was, I think, very much thought of in their mind as a follow-on from Gypsy, because if you think biographical show about Gypsy Rose...
With a lot of pastiche or parody numbers of vaudeville and that era, and you think, especially with Gypsy, I thought, were the songs this clever back then, with the moo cow and all that kind of stuff? Or is the writing too good to be present, because it's heightened up, the quality of the writing is excellent because it's a musical theatre piece? Is it better than what we would have seen had we seen the original
No,
Fanny Bryce?
I think I've seen quite a few excerpts of Fanny Bryce on television. Not only was she a great singer and an artful dancer, but she was a good actress. And when you see Fanny Bryce sing My Man, it still seems incredibly up to date. And in some ways, Fanny Bryce, dare I say it, was a better comedian than Barbra Streisand. And she really was very funny, and she used this old-fashioned Yiddish comedy, which was very much part of the Lower East Side New York humour. She used that brilliantly. I think in that respect, she was one of the first, certainly the first female comedian who used her Jewish roots, because people were a little bit nervous. The immigrant Jews in New York, although they dominated show business by the 20s in America, they were often a bit nervous to actually refer very much to that particular, to joke about Jewishness, or to make Jewish jokes publicly. But Fanny Bryce built her whole career on doing that, and hence the Mademoiselle from Armentières, the Private Schwartz, is a kind of parody of the Yiddish speaking.
It was like something in Cabaret.
Jew, yes, absolutely, and I think it's not. You see, I think to answer to your question, I think that actually the original was just as funny, if not funnier, and just as well written in its own way for its period. If you think about it, they took a Fanny Bryce number, My Man, and put it into the film, which I think doesn't occur in the stage show, put it into the film for Streisand to sing. Streisand also sang, I think, on records, Secondhand Rose, which I don't think is in the show either, which was an original Fanny Bryce number.
This shows the kind of, not the flaw, but the problem I had with it. I sat there thinking, again, comparing it to Gypsy, which I know I shouldn't do, but I felt like this is where a lot of the cut tunes from Gypsy ended up.
I think it is a sort of second-rate Gypsy. But having said that, Gypsy is so good, even a second-rate Gypsy
Yeah, of course.
is
I mean,
better
Julie
than
Stein,
most.
who cannot, who wouldn't want to sit and listen to Don't Rain on My Parade being belted out with a wonderful band, which I must say, unlike Gypsy, had strings in it, which was wonderful. I think we had experienced what we call second night blues, if you've heard that expression, which means that Sheridan Smith, let's say, wasn't singing the notes at the end of Act 1 as long as she could have. She would cut off and the orchestra would still be playing, and then she'd hit her pose and the lights would snap to black. So I don't think she was on full vocal performance, but she was very, very good. The general response upon leaving the auditorium, I heard, was Sheridan is amazing. They weren't mentioning the story, they weren't mentioning anyone else. You know, this is like Glenn Close in Sunset Boulevard at the moment. People aren't going to see Sunset Boulevard. You go to see that person above that title.
There are great songs in Funny Girl. Some of them as good, even better than some of the songs in Gypsy, although I'm saying that musically. I don't think the lyrics are ever as good as the lyrics in Gypsy, simply because they don't work in a sophisticated way to enhance the book and the characters and the situations in the way that sometimes lyrics.
Do we know if Sondheim was
always do.
approached about Funny Girl?
I'm not sure. I don't think so. I don't think by that stage.
Would it then be two compared to Gypsy?
He then wanted to write music and lyrics, so he wouldn't have allowed himself to work with Stein anymore. So I think that musically it's in a way as good as Gypsy, although it's
not as iconic, is it?
Yes, because it's a rerun. It's doing the same sort of thing as Gypsy and using the same sort of music as Gypsy, but it doesn't have the book, the coherence, the cohesiveness of Gypsy as a book with music and lyrics that fit perfectly.
I also felt that some of the songs you could tell were of the 1960s, written with Barbra Streisand in mind. Some people, for example...
You mean people, not some people.
I know.
That's a Freudian slip.
Yeah, and also there's a song in it that starts Fanny, which is interesting. And there were a lot of musical licks that I noticed from Gypsy also. So you can see why I sort of sat there, and especially
Absolutely.
you're in the same theatre.
The overture seems to me to be, modelled in a way on the brassy, wonderful overture from Gypsy.
Yeah. The whole score is, I think, and that's not a bad thing, as you say. I wasn't as gripped by it as I would have liked, I will say, but that's because I went in not knowing anything about it. And
It's quite a weak book, I think, especially in the second half.
you've got to consider that Harvey Feinstein has now stepped in, and I don't know what he's done to the book, but he's reworked it. So I dread to think what the book was like.
Have you seen the Streisand film?
No. This is my first ever Funny Girl
Because I
experience.
wonder if Sheridan managed to eradicate the memory of Streisand, or are people coming out sort of forgetting how good Streisand was, or
I think because she's such a British legend, not a legend, but she's such a British
icon in a way. She's an
icon.
yeah.
They're not really that. I mean, people before the show was starting were saying, Barbra Streisand was in the original, and how will she compare, and things like that. And at the end, when she came out, 1,200 people stood up immediately, and that very rarely happens in this country. I think, she has introduced a whole new generation to this musical. I never saw it at the Menier, but I read that for this production they expanded numbers, they added more dance breaks, which is wonderful. The orchestra were brilliant. I mean, they really were brilliant, and a nice big sound. The design was interesting. One moment stood out to me was, the Savoy has those sort of weird tiles that go around the whole of the side of the auditorium. For the obviously Art Deco railway station ends at 1, as opposed to the very dark, smoky railway station that ends at 1 of Gypsy. They continued that motif around the back of the cyclorama of the stage. So it was like it's like we are in that entire railway station, which I thought was very nice. A lot of mirrors everywhere, obviously to introduce some deeper allegory within the piece that Fanny Bryce is constantly looking at herself, because it opens with a flashback, doesn't it?
Yes, and it's a sort of reflection on what being a star is.
Yeah. It's no fault of the show. I'm just a bit tired of these 1930s American backstage musicals about being a star. Do you see what I mean?
Yes. I think I think the show, brilliant as it was in its day, has had its day.
And when was the last big one we had here of Funny Girl? When was the last?
There hasn't been one since Streisand brought it to London in the 60s.
Again, it's like Gypsy. This is bringing it here. It's amazing to see it again, and Dreamgirls is coming next to the Savoy, which is interesting, isn't it?
Well, that's an early 80s musical.
Yes.
So. And of course we have recently seen a film.
And also another big announcement is that An American in Paris is coming.
Which I've seen in New York, which I think is absolutely brilliantly staged. And anyone who's seen the film, don't worry about this being a complete copy of the film. It's not at all. It does lots of different things, and the book is quite different.
Do we think it will survive?
Brilliantly choreographed.
Do we think it will survive in the Dominion Theatre?
I do think it will. Yes.
Funny Girl is playing. I don't know if we'll ever see a stage show of Funny Lady.
I hope we don't.
Was that Judy Stein as well? Or
No, that was Candour and Ebb, although the score is wonderful, but the book is even worse than the book for Funny Girl.
maybe Harvey Fierstein should come in and rewrite the book for Funny Lady.
That would have been a good... Yes.
Well, but Gordon, thank you very, very much. So your homework, listeners, is to, if you're not aware of Victoria Wismatil, go and check it out on YouTube and go and see Funny Girl. Well, but thank you very much, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, Nick.